So I thought we would just have a brief discussion and overview about some of the big picture trends in neglected diseases and Chagas disease in particular. And I thought not to go into a deep dive into any of the specifics about Chagas disease, because we're going to do that during the course of the day, but just to give kind of a broad overview of where I see this fitting in terms of the global landscape. We all know about the Millennium Development Goals, now moving into the Sustainable Development Goals. One of the opportunities that we have now that we finished the MDGs is we have metrics, and these metrics were set up through the Global Burden of Disease study headed by Chris Murray at the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation in Seattle, and we've got these capstone papers coming out to really look at the impact of what's been happening with all of the big picture programs that were launched at the beginning of the MDGs, including PEPFAR, the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, President's Malaria Initiative, the NTD program of USAID, and of course similar programs coming out of the United Kingdom. And these are what some of the capstone papers look like. They're incredible. This is only half the author list. Looks like a paper coming out of the CERN Physics Laboratory. It's really quite an undertaking. I'm actually here somewhere. Is my arrow showing up on the screen? No, but well, you'll just have to. It's like Where's Waldo? You'll have to go and look for my name there someplace. So it's this massive undertaking. And the first part of the story is from Millennium Development Goal number 6 to combat AIDS, malaria, and other diseases. PEPFAR's had a huge impact, 19 million lives saved from HIV/AIDS. Same with the President's Malaria Initiative and the Global Fund, of course, with a 30% reduction in malaria cases and deaths. But then we have the inconvenient truth that there's this third component to the MDGs, number 6, the other diseases, which really never generated a lot of advocacy. And so we got together back in the early 2000s with David Molyneux at Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine, Alan Fennick, and did a bit of a branding exercise where we labeled them as the neglected tropical diseases. The initial list had 13 or 14 tropical infections that are highly prevalent, disabling, often chronic conditions, and very importantly, both occur in the setting of poverty and promoting poverty. And then I wrote this popular book for consumption, which my kids would always call Dad's Forgotten Book on Forgotten People with Forgotten Diseases, to raise awareness. And now it got translated into Japanese, which was pretty exciting. So I showed that to my kids, and they still are not impressed. And so here are the new numbers coming out of the current prevalence of these neglected tropical diseases, and they keep on getting refined as we learn more information. This is the latest one coming out of the GBD 2015, and including hundreds of millions of people with helminth infections, and then the list goes down: lymphatic filariasis, river blindness, Chagas disease, leishmaniasis, trachoma, cysticercosis, and now they've added Zika and Ebola virus infection, of course, to the list of NTDs. Now, in the early 2000s, we set out to look at assembling a package of medicines to take on these diseases, and we started in particular with the 3 intestinal worms: schistosomiasis, lymphatic filariasis, onchocerciasis, and trachoma, and we're able to write about the potential impact of combining drug treatments in a package, and then we had to, because they were neglected tropical diseases, we had to do a fair amount of advocacy around this, and we love this. It came out in the International Business Times. 3 scientists marketed, and so now I'm a marketer of neglected tropical diseases, and raised $1 billion. We worked with the Bush administration and former President Clinton at the Clinton Global Initiative, and there was a lot of luck involved in terms of President Bush had just launched PEPFAR, and they were looking for another big picture initiative to look at, and so the timing was good. And also this was a good time in Washington when Democrats actually spoke to Republicans and Republicans actually spoke to Democrats, and you could actually get things done, unlike the toxic environment we have now. So now the Global Burden of Disease study has said, okay, what's been the impact of this? And the numbers are looking pretty exciting. What we're seeing now is a 50% reduction in the prevalence of lymphatic filariasis, salmon river blindness, trachoma, ascariasis, and then outside of the package, big impact towards the elimination of sleeping sickness, and big, of course, guinea worm through the activities of the Carter Center, WHO and CDC, big declines in rabies and cysticercosis. So we can actually talk about some of these neglected tropical diseases as potential elimination targets. That's the good news. But then we have some bad news. Then we got some significant setbacks. So we're not really making a lot of progress on schistosomiasis. Two of the intestinal worms have not gone down appreciably, hookworm and whipworm, and for some of them, they're just taking off. So dengue and other arbovirus infections are rising precipitously. Chagas disease is not really going down, according to the Global Burden of Disease study. Leishmaniasis is way up, especially in the conflict zones in the Middle East, where cutaneous leishmaniasis has just exploded, and in East Africa now, in Sudan and Somalia, visceral leishmaniasis has taken off. Then, of course, some of the zoonotic diseases. So if I had to summarize this, I'd say the ones that we're particularly losing the battle on globally are vector-borne neglected diseases transmitted by arthropods or snails, and some of the zoonotic viral diseases. So that's a long way of getting to the punchline here, which is that it seems like we're playing what I call a game of global health whack-a-mole, where we're making enormous progress on AIDS, malaria, some of the neglected tropical diseases, childhood diseases that are preventable by vaccines. We didn't talk about that, but there's a lot of progress there. But now we've got to deal with the vector-borne NTDs and the zoonotic NTDs. So some examples, of course, in the Western Hemisphere, you've had the emergence of dengue, or the reemergence of dengue, now chikungunya across the Western Hemisphere after getting introduced in 2013. Certainly Zika virus infection. What people are not as aware of is the same thing is happening across the Atlantic and Southern Europe, where we've seen malaria return to Greece after it's been gone for 70 years, chikungunya, West Nile virus in Italy, Spain, southern France, dengue in Portugal, schistosomiasis now on the island of Corsica. And we're trying to understand what the basis of all of that is. In addition, now, in terms of Chagas disease, here are the numbers that we're at, 7 to 8 million cases worldwide. There's a wide disparity in the number of deaths, 8,000 to 40,000 annual deaths. I'm not going to go through the life cycle because I think enough of us know about that here, but just to do a deeper dive on the global burden of disease study, these are the numbers, 6.65 million prevalent cases, according to GBD 2015, 8,000 deaths, and they're pretty close to the WHO numbers, 5.74 million, 1.17 case people living with Chagas cardiomyopathy. I think that one of the big surprises has been the results of the benefit study, which showed a level of mortality that I think surprised and upset everybody, which is that found that 17 to 18% of people with Chagas cardiomyopathy will die over 5 years. So, if you look at, there's 1 million people now living with Chagas cardiomyopathy. If 17 to 18% are going to die over the next 5 years, that's 200,000 people. So we're maybe looking at maybe 40,000 deaths per year. So I think what's happening now at the Global Burden of Disease study is Chris Murray has tasked a man named Jeff Stanaway to revisit all the disease burden estimates for the NTDs, because almost universally they're way too low. The numbers for schistosomiasis are just ridiculously low in terms of disability-adjusted life years and deaths, same with some of the others, and Chagas is now on that list. So we may see a big re-evaluation, revamping of the disease burden estimates for Chagas disease and others coming out of the GBD 2016 or GBD 2017. So the question for this group, let's make this a little interactive, is what's going on? Why are we seeing these paranormal phenomena in Southern Europe, where it's this sudden explosion of vector-borne disease, and why are we seeing this in the Western Hemisphere as well? What's happening? Is there a common theme to all of this? Human migrations of people. So certainly in southern Europe, maybe people coming from the conflict zones across the Mediterranean or through Eastern Europe. There's a lot of human migratory activity, people fleeing, the diaspora coming out of Venezuela. So certainly human migrations. What else is going on? Climate change. So you've talked to the climate change people. They will say, well, next to the Arctic, southern Europe is one of the next big shoes to fall, same in some of the regions, Middle East, in the Western Hemisphere. But what else is going on?
Sort of erosion of public health programs.
Erosion of public health programs, and why is that happening?
I mean, I think a consequence of just global neoliberalism and less government investment in public.
I think that's a fair point. What else is happening? What's happening to the economy of Greece? People are going like this. Yeah, it's tanking. And what about Italy, Spain, and across southern Europe? So poverty is a risk factor, right? So what is it? Is it the human migrations? Is it the climate change? Is it the economic downturns? Is it the collapse of public health infrastructures? And the answer is, we have no idea, right? Right? We have absolutely no idea, right? And why do we have no idea? Because nobody talks to each other, right? When was the last time you had a virologist engaged in a dialogue with an earth scientist talking about climate change, or with an economist or a social scientist, right? Nobody talks to the social scientists, right? We don't talk to the political, they don't talk to the political scientists, they don't talk to the anthropologists. So we don't have a mechanism either in universities or in government agencies to engage in this uncomfortable dialogue. We're all very silent. If you're a virologist, your incentives are only to write papers and grants for other virologists, and same with each of the disciplines. So I think now we're paying the consequences of this, and I think this is going to be one of the real problems that we have to solve, is how to address complex phenomena like the rise of disease in southern Europe or across the Americas. There's a term that I've, maybe it's kind of flavor of the month, but there's a term that I like using to describe some of these things. It's kind of bantied around college campuses and not so much in the real world, but I think it's a pretty cool term. It's called the Anthropocene. How many people have heard of it? So basically what it says is, if you look at the big geological epochs, the Pleistocene, the Pliocene, now we're in the Holocene that began at the end of the Ice Age. The idea is humans have so profoundly altered the world and the environment that we've now bought ourselves our own geological epoch. So it's a proposed epoch that begins when human activity started to have a significant global impact on Earth's geology and ecosystems. And we've been trying to kind of look at this holistic pieces of the kinds of things we've been talking about this morning, and the role in promoting neglected tropical diseases, deforestation, urbanization, human migrations, climate change, conflict, and political destabilization, which is clearly a big driver. And then, of course, there's poverty, and poverty is still extremely a dominant factor. And one of the things that I've done now in my new second forgotten book, called Blue Marble Health, is to really look at poverty and poverty-related neglected diseases. And we've come up with something that we're not quite sure what to do with, but it's a little counterintuitive, and we're trying to get our arms around it. And here's the most provocative picture from the book, which is the new map of global health. It's saying that since the launch of the Millennium Development Goals, either because of the Millennium Development Goals or maybe in spite of it, the world has changed. There has, the paradigm of developing versus developed countries has morphed. In some way, that's your father's global health or your mother's global health. And what we're seeing instead is a general rise in economic development that leaves behind a bottom segment of society. And when we look at where most of the poverty-related neglected diseases are, and we did this both with WHO data and global burden of disease data, and it came out very similar, is that most of the world's poverty-related neglected diseases are actually in the 20 wealthiest economies, the G20 countries, together with Nigeria, which is, even though it's not a G20 country, it has an economy bigger than the bottom 3 or 4 G20 countries. Now you might say, well, how can that be? If these are poverty-related diseases, the idea it's the poor living among the wealthy in G20 countries that now account for most of the world's worm infections, This is just a few examples: leishmaniasis, tuberculosis, dengue, Chagas disease, leprosy, etc. And this has a lot of policy importance because, as we're seeing with big budget cuts to the U.S. government's commitment to global health potentially in the coming years, something similar is happening on the UK side. So what's the number one funder of neglected disease R&D in the world? What country? Dr. Hall, what country? United by far, right? And number two? United Kingdom. Number three? That's the government called the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Number four? Probably Germany and Holland. And then the bottom falls out. And the point is, the other G20 countries are not really contributing that much to global health R&D or global health mass treatment options. So I think this has got to be one of the things that really gets on the radar screen for the G20 countries. So we're working now, trying to get something in time for the Hamburg summit, G20 summit. I'm not very optimistic we're going to be able to work that quickly, but this is going to. That's, I think, one of the places that we're going to have to look at is with our Office of Global Health Diplomacy in the State Department. That is where the education has to happen, I think, at the level of the G20, because the U.S. and the UK government right now don't have a lot of appetite for global health, unfortunately. Not in this administration. In the UK side, when you comments by Priti Patel and others coming out of the British Department for International Development, we have to look out for, it's basically the UK equivalent of America First. We're going to have to look elsewhere. So let's give a couple of examples of this. Let's look at our favorite disease, Chagas disease. So based on WHO numbers and GBD numbers, the vast majority of people living with Chagas disease on a total numbers basis live in Latin America's three wealthiest economies, Brazil, Mexico, and Argentina. And what percentage of those people living in Argentina, Brazil, and Mexico have access to diagnosis and treatment? Somebody? Less than one? I think we call that zero, right? Let's round off. So basically nobody, right? So here's an example, right? So no commitment from elected or political leaders to their own populations within the G20 countries. What part of Brazil is Brazil's poorest part? Northeast Brazil. So this is where we see not only Chagas disease but leishmaniasis and schistosomiasis. There's a reason why microcephaly arose and Zika arose out of northeastern Brazil. It's the most impoverished part of the country. So again, the poor living among the wealthy. And now what we're seeing is the spread of Zika northward into Venezuela and Colombia. What's happening in Venezuela right now? What's happening with the economy of Venezuela? Yeah, it doesn't have an economy, right? So it's collapsing. So what we're seeing now is not only widespread Zika transmission, but also resurgence of Chagas disease, including oral ingestion, foodborne Chagas disease, return of schistosomiasis, even urban schistosomiasis, malaria, dengue taking off. And now it's moving northward, of course, into southern Texas. So we've had transmission of Zika, for instance, in South Texas all during the winter, in Cameron County, Hidalgo County, and it's been one of the warmest winters on record in Texas, so we're quite concerned. Now, what about poverty and disease in Texas? I'd mentioned, when I showed you that original blue marble health map, I provocatively had the southern part of the United States in here as well. Now, do we really have that level of poverty in the United States? So let's look at Texas. So here's a picture of some of this unincorporated, what are called colonias on the South Texas near the border. You see a lot of things here that look very exciting for Zika virus and other arbovirus transmission, standing water, dilapidated housing, nothing more than an Aedes aegypti mosquito likes more than tires. Texas is the tire dumping capital of the world, living here in Texas. But this is right outside of, this is in Houston. This is a couple of miles north of the downtown area. This is definitely way within Houston. That's called the Fifth Ward. It's a historic African-American ward that was started by freed slaves right after the Civil War. And again, you see incredible levels of environmental degradation. This is substandard housing, people living here, no air conditioning, no window screens. So I think we are very vulnerable. This is the poverty map of Texas. We have 20 million Americans that live in extreme poverty at half the U.S. poverty level, and we have 1.65 million families now in the U.S. living on less than $2 a day, according to the University of Michigan Center for Poverty. So we've just now done a brief analysis of number of people living with a neglected tropical disease in the state of Texas. And the numbers have pretty wide confidence intervals. This is the CDC estimate of the number of people living with Chagas disease in Texas, but things like toxocariasis and trichomoniasis. And we're trying to now work with the state legislature. We just introduced, I just got signed by the governor, a House bill that's going to start doing neglected disease surveillance in the state of Texas. And now we're in discussions now with Senator Cory Booker in New Jersey, together with Representative Chris Brown, who's also from New Jersey, that is going to try to really do a better job at doing active surveillance, looking for these diseases, and to see if it might be possible to get some authorizing legislation in this very difficult financial time. I'm telling you that so when you get the call, you'll know who did that. Because what happens is they call the NIH, they call Francis Collins calls Tony Fauci, and Tony Fauci calls Lee. Lee says, Lee, fix this, which he always does, so he always just steps up. So Dr. Hall's one of the unsung heroes in the U.S. government for our neglected disease, so I'm so happy to see you here, Lee. A lot of this is through immigration, but we're also, our scientists in Houston are finding a lot of evidence of transmission. And I think this is one of the big unknowns that we face trying to understand Chagas disease. It's assumed that almost all of the Chagas diseases in the U.S. is coming across the southern border. But we're pushing back on that a little bit, finding a lot more autochthonous transmission than I think people realized, including people living with Chagas cardiomyopathy who've never left the state of Texas. So this is an unfolding story that I think is going to get very interesting over time. This is the new CDC estimate of 238,000 cases, and these numbers will continue to be refined. And then, of course, we have the problem of the globalization of Chagas disease. But on top of that, we have the concern that we have this problem of ongoing political destabilization in parts of the Americas, and this is going to also promote the resurgence, especially in places like Venezuela. So, of course, I think today we'll get into the weeds a little bit about the needs to develop new drugs. I should add diagnostics here, vaccines against these Anthropocene NTDs, focusing on Chagas disease. And my favorite quote about this comes from David Letterman, who I think pointed to the problem of research and development on neglected diseases better than anyone, who said that Pepsi has a new Doritos-flavored Mountain Dew. No, we don't have an Ebola vaccine, but we do have the Doritos-flavored Mountain Dew. And this refers to the fact, when the Ebola vaccine was developed at the Vaccine Research Center at NIH, that was published in 2003. In Nature magazine by Gary Nabel's group and others. And what happened was the technology sat there in terms of it just incrementally advanced into some phase 1 trials and didn't really progress to scale-up manufacture and widespread clinical testing. And the reason was nobody cared, right? It was a neglected disease of poverty. What happened was the U.S. government, through the Biomedical Advanced Research Development Authority, BARDA, put up substantial amounts of funds. Then finally, GSK, Merck, Crucell came in and did an amazing job turning it around into a bottle of vaccine in a record period of time. They started clinical testing. And what happened when they started clinical testing of the Ebola vaccine? there was no more Ebola, right? But 11,000 people died in the interim. That lives could have been prevented. So we still have this terrible problem that our scientific ability to produce technologies has outpaced our political, social, and financial instruments that we have to really get them out there. And we have a lot of urgency now with Chagas disease from the results of the benefit trial showing that trypanocytal therapy and with benznidazole in patients with established Chagas cardiomyopathy, while it significantly reduced serum parasite detection, did not significantly reduce cardiac clinical deterioration through 5 years of follow-up. So this is a slide from my colleagues at DNDi, which really points out that we have this terrible innovation gap. One of the things that we're trying to do in Houston is we're looking at developing a lot of vaccines for different neglected diseases. We have programs now for vaccines for schistosomiasis and leishmaniasis, and also hookworm infection, West Nile virus infection, and we have a program for Chagas disease. And this one we're working with DNDi and others to see how we can partner with them to look at it on top of benznidazole. The idea that this would be a therapeutic vaccine that wouldn't be used alone, but might be used in combination with other antiparasitic therapies. And we've got a lot of exciting results with one of these recombinant proteins known as TC24, which we had to modify because the cysteines were forming intermolecular disulfide bonds, so we re-engineered it to take those out and put in serines, and we solved that problem and showed that together with a TLR4 agonist from ASI known as E6020, we were getting some pretty impressive effects in terms of preventing the fibrosis that you would see in control mice, but preventing that and then showing that by EKG and echoes that the structure of the heart seemed to normalize even with low-dose benznidazole together, and sometimes without it at all. So we're really now looking at how we can build a program looking at multiple antigens and testing them, and maybe today we'll get into the weeds a little bit of some of the complexities of a clinical development plan for something like this. Do we do this in determinate patients, which you could look at over 5 years because you know the controls, 17 to 18% will die over 5 years, which could give you a shorter clinical timeline. If you have to now go into indeterminate patients, you could be looking at a decade or 2 decade long clinical trial, which, you know, who knows if anyone would ever fund that. So those are all my introductory remarks. I'll just show you my last slide because I think this is the common denominator of people in this room. They addressed Mahatma Gandhi's issue where he talks about the 7 social sins, which is politics without principle, wealth without work, pleasure without conscience, knowledge without character, commerce without morality, science without humanity, and worship without sacrifice. So this is what everyone in this room has figured out, is that we're going to add humanity to our science. And so I just want to congratulate all of you for all of your hard work and all your successes. So thank you very much.